On the 23rd of June 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union with a slim majority. As we near the 10-year anniversary of that referendum, I'm asking the question, is a third referendum the answer to the growing far right in the UK? You heard that right, a third referendum. More on that later. But before we talk about the pros and cons of rejoining the EU, first, some history on what the EU actually is. After the Second World War, there were calls to unify Europe, with the European communities, a collection of institutions focused on reducing barriers to trade between its members, being established in 1952, with its initial members being Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany, with the UK being the first country to sign an association agreement in 1954. The UK then attempted to formally join the European communities in 1961, but that was vetoed by France. This happened again in 1967, but in 1969 the third attempt was successful and the UK joined the European communities in 1973. This was a controversial decision at the time. Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath had joined the European communities through an Act of Parliament, and the Labour Party had four main concerns. They feared handing over some of our control to the European community would degrade our democratic powers. They were concerned that the UK could end up paying more for food, shifting our focus away from the British overseas colonies where imports were cheap, though of course internationally controversial due to their reliance on the exploitation of local populations. They saw the European community as less socialist than the UK, so our newly established welfare state and NHS could be under threat. And finally, they saw a risk of increasing the cost of living, as there would be greater competition for jobs with a large group of countries capable of undercutting UK workers. And so Harold Wilson's Labour Party ran in the 1974 general election with the manifesto pledge of holding a referendum on continuing the membership in the community. This first referendum on Britain's place in Europe returned an overwhelming majority. 67% voted to remain. And for decades after that, both the major parties, Labour and Conservative, were committed to the European project, ensuring we gained tighter relationships that benefited both the UK and the community that would later become the European Union. It is difficult to find a time when the discussion around leaving the EU truly started. Some may point to the formation of the Anti-Federalist League, a precursor to the UK Independence Party formed in 1992. But any discussion of leaving the EU at this time would have been little more than murmurs. However, throughout the 2000s, UKIP started to gain traction, predominantly, but not exclusively, amongst right-leaning individuals. This was especially prevalent in the UK's EU elections. With donations from wealthy individuals and businesses, UKIP began advertising on a huge scale, winning 16.1% of the vote in the 2004 European parliamentary elections. But still only a fringe party in mainstream politics, only securing 2.2% of the vote in the 2005 general election. In 2006, UKIP elected a new leader, a familiar face for many of us in the UK, but not so much then. Nigel Farage. Despite his wealthy, privately educated background, Farage managed to cultivate an image as a man of the people, calling then leader of the Conservative Party David Cameron a socialist, saying his priorities were gay marriage, foreign aid and wind farms, insinuating these were all negative policies. In the following years, a series of failings by the establishment played into UKIP's hands. In 2009, it emerged that many MPs across almost every party in the UK had been abusing their powers to expense homes that had not been used as part of their duties, cleaners, home improvements and much more, costing the taxpayer a fortune, which resulted in a surge of support for UKIP and their best performance yet in the 2009 European elections. Then followed the 2010 general election, which resulted in a hung parliament resolved by a coalition between the Conservative Party, led by David Cameron, and the Liberal Democrats, under Nick Clegg. This government was unpopular for many reasons. Their introduction of austerity measures was seen as a means of benefiting the upper class and increasing hardship on the working class. This produced further support for an anti-establishment party. People were becoming fed up of the duopoly of Labour and Conservatives, and the other major parties like the Lib Dems were also tangled up in the mess. UKIP, being the main anti-establishment party, continued to garner support. Ironically, however, they actually supported the austerity measures, and Nigel Farage continues to this day. But without an anti-establishment party on the left, there was nowhere else to go for disenfranchised voters. This migration of voters from the major parties led to UKIP's greatest results, getting 23% of the vote in the 2013 local elections and 27.5% of the vote in the 2014 European elections, where they took the spot of the largest party, which is actually on par with the 26% of the vote Reform UK achieved in the 2026 local elections. Seeing his party losing support to UKIP, Conservative Party leader and then Prime Minister David Cameron began to give Eurosceptic speeches and promised reforms on the UK's EU membership, ultimately running with the manifesto pledge of holding a referendum on the UK's membership within the EU. The Conservatives returned a majority in the 2015 general election, with UKIP gaining 12.6% of the vote. It appeared David Cameron's strategy of appeasement had worked, at least for now. But there was a big problem for David Cameron. He opposed leaving the EU himself, but also wanted to frame himself as a safe haven for the anti-establishment, anti-migration UKIP crowd. This, along with a Eurosceptic Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, meant that the Remain campaign was poorly fought. The Leave campaign, on the other hand, championed by Nigel Farage and future Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson, was well funded and well run, ultimately convincing the public on issues of immigration, and largely on a promise of being able to increase funding for the NHS by £350 million a week, a figure that has since been proven to be false. And so, on the 23rd of June 2016, the UK voted to leave the European Union, with a slim 51.89% voting to leave against 48.11% voting to remain. And, on the 11th of July, having staked his premiership on the Remain vote, David Cameron resigns as the leader of the Conservative Party, with Theresa May becoming the Prime Minister. With Cameron out the door, May was left with the tough decisions. What did Brexit look like? What sort of a relationship should the UK have with the EU after leaving? And what were the timescales on which to act? Theresa May stated she wanted a sensible and orderly departure from the EU. And with concerns that many of the opposition parties would be against her plans for Brexit, she called for an early election in 2017, which she believed would give her more time and more power to achieve the deal she wanted with the European Union. However, this gamble did not pay off. With early polls showing the Conservatives would win by a landslide, they ultimately lost their majority with a large Labour resurgence under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. May was forced to do a deal with the DUP to form a majority government. This was just the start of the political chaos that had now enveloped the UK since the Brexit vote. Both politicians and the population were massively divided on whether we should go through with it and what the deal should look like. May invoked Article 50 on the 29th of March 2017, setting a deadline for the UK to leave the EU on the 29th of March 2019, although several extensions were given, with the ultimate date for ending negotiations being the 31st of October 2019. Theresa May had also negotiated a deal with the EU which she put to the House of Commons, but they rejected it 3 times, and although she survived a no-confidence vote that followed these rejections by just 19 votes, she resigned shortly afterwards. Boris Johnson, a big name in the Brexit campaign, then took office as leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister in order to, in his words, get Brexit done. Despite spending much of his political career supporting the EU, he had switched to the Brexit camp, correctly recognising its unique opportunity to benefit him personally and propel him into the top job. Shortly after becoming leader, Boris Johnson called for yet another election, but this time he was successful, delivering a huge majority for the Conservative Party. The nation was frustrated with the tediousness of Brexit and how it had dominated the conversation while their lives were being made worse by continued Conservative austerity. Unfortunately, the Labour Party did not offer an alternative. Although Jeremy Corbyn was very popular amongst his voter base, he was relatively quiet on the topic of Brexit, being a Eurosceptic himself, and so failed to garner Remainer support. During his premiership, Boris Johnson illegally prorogued Parliament in an attempt to stop negotiations in Parliament and force his agenda through. The establishment was continuing to fail the public. At 11 p.m. on the 31st of January 2020, the UK exited the European Union with no deal between the UK and the single market. The impacts of this cannot be understated. It is estimated that our GDP per capita is 6 to 8% lower, investments are 12 to 18% lower, employment is 3 to 4% lower, and productivity is also 3 to 4% lower. In other words, each and every one of us would be making £3,180 a year more on average. And the so-called benefits like extra money for our NHS never materialised. In fact, NHS funding has fallen on average against inflation since we left the single market. So given all of this damage to the UK economy, rejoining the EU is a no-brainer, right? Well, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. There are many downsides to EU membership. Firstly, there is a high cost to members. Though not as high as the Leave campaign made out, it's still around £15 billion annually. Then there is the argument of infringement on sovereignty. By joining a group with a higher level parliament and court system, we are handing away some of our own controls. Thirdly, the EU has a history of leaning towards neoliberal ways of thinking, pressuring Greece and other member states to accept austerity when higher taxation would have been a better solution to their economic crises. Finally, the democratic process of the EU itself is convoluted. The veto system where any one country can block a decision has been slowing down their ability to expand and reform. The presidents that lead the EU are selected by MEPs, so although British citizens can vote for MEPs, they do not directly elect the EU's leaders. Representing different countries with different populations is hard, and so parties from different countries often disagree, making the process of new law and reform even slower. So what about the positives? Well, as we've seen since Brexit, the damage to the economy was far greater than the membership fee, and so paying the fee will be well worth the uplift the economy can expect from reduced barriers to trade. Another big benefit is the greater swing on the world stage the UK has being part of a larger bloc. The argument of lost sovereignty is fair, but why stop there? Manchester loses its sovereignty by being part of England, and could govern itself with more controls specific to the local population if it was independent. But it is clear that Manchester alone would have little to no swing when it came to trade deals with Canada, the EU and other trading partners. So being part of England and the UK makes sense. The same can be said for the UK being part of the EU. By being part of something larger, we have more power on the world stage. The free movement of people is a controversial point, but the money gained from European tourism and workers coming to fill in gaps in the economy is incredibly beneficial. With nearly 2 million fewer tourists coming from the EU each year since Brexit, it is clear we would benefit from their return. And finally, it is easier to reform the problems with the EU from the inside. It has pressured countries into austerity in the past, but it also has some of the greatest digital protections for its citizens in the entire world, and it's one of the only blocs to push back against the US tech giants. And, as our largest trading partner, it can exert great pressure on the UK. At least as a member, we have a say in the future of the bloc, rather than being stuck between the rock and the hard place of our current position of trying to appease both the United States and the European Union. Now, in 2026, 6 years and 3 Prime Ministers after Brexit, and nearly 10 years since the referendum to leave, almost 56% of the UK public support rejoining the EU, with only 35% opposed. Since they came to power in 2024, Keir Starmer's Labour have been continuing the trend of the establishment letting the public down, losing popularity with their voter base, many going to the Green Party, now poised as an anti-establishment party on the left, with nearly 4 times the number of voters leaving Labour to the Greens as to Reform. UKIP has fallen in popularity to the point of political irrelevance, but not its former leader Nigel Farage. He leads a new party, Reform UK, who have been rising in popularity, currently at 27.3% in the polls, the most popular party. Reform is nearly 3 times more popular than Brexit, with only 11% of the population saying it has been a success. 1 in 3 Reform supporters believe Brexit was a failure. This disconnect between support for Brexit and support for the man that made it happen is no doubt because of the anti-establishment image that Reform has created. Ironically, Reform is largely funded by the ultra-wealthy and big businesses. They serve the establishment and the interests of the wealthy. But this difference in interests in the supporters for Reform and the party's politicians brings an opportunity. Interestingly, 22% of Leave voters have changed their mind, saying they would now support the UK rejoining the EU, and 14% of Reform voters support rejoining. The 2026 local elections, where Reform captured 26% of the vote, has thrown Labour into chaos, with another in a string of challenges to Starmer's leadership. With the Labour Party leadership being called into question yet again, the idea of rejoining has been brought back into the limelight. Sandro Gozzi, the chair of the European delegation to the EU-UK Parliamentary Assembly, said it would be seen as a great victory for the European project for the UK to rejoin the EU. He went on to say that the UK would be welcomed back quickly, with minimal red tape due to our existing alignment, and that it was unlikely that adopting the euro would be a red line. It is very likely that on these terms, a referendum to rejoin the EU quickly and painlessly would be very popular with the public in the UK. Holding that referendum before the next election would be an opportunity for Labour to regain support and put Reform in a very difficult position. Rejoining the EU is incredibly popular with the Greens and the left generally, and so Labour could regain some of the credibility for the establishment's ability to deliver causes for the benefit of those individuals. On the other side of the political spectrum, Nigel Farage is very heavily tied to the Leave campaign and would be incredibly against the UK rejoining. And after the referendum to leave, he was incredibly against further referendums, calling them undemocratic. If the referendum to rejoin passed, they would be left in a very tricky situation in the lead up to the 2029 general election, choosing between a democratic vote by the public and a future they did not believe in. But there is more at stake than the 2029 general election. Scotland overwhelmingly supported the Remain vote, and, since Brexit, the idea that Scotland should leave the UK and rejoin the EU separately has increased in popularity. Nationalist governments have also become the largest parties in Wales and Northern Ireland, the first time in UK history where nationalist parties control all three of the devolved countries' parliaments. Rejoining the EU would help keep the UK together by stemming nationalism in all four countries. I believe now is the time for a third referendum. It could be the answer to Reform, and help Labour regain some public support, while quickly improving each of our lives and helping to keep the United Kingdom united. Thanks so much for listening. Let me know what you think in the comments. I would love to discuss the merits of rejoining the EU with you. If you enjoyed this video, please like it. It really helps me out. And if you want to hear more, please subscribe. Cheers.